Well, good afternoon or good morning, wherever you may be. My name is Ross McKinney, and I'm here to welcome you to our workshop on the sponsor influence on research and essentially conflict of interest and questions about how conflict of interest on the basis of the sponsorship of the research affects the outcome, the interpretation, the performance of the research. Yesterday, we heard a lot about the basic dilemmas that are involved in sponsorship. And now we're going to be having a session today that takes examples. And we will have a series of speakers, each of whom will have 20 minutes to talk about an issue or a domain, a field of research, and the effect that sponsor influence can have in that field of research. And then after we have all those discussions, we will have a prolonged period of time for free-form discussion between our speakers and you, the audience. So we're looking forward to this, and I hope it is a worthwhile endeavor, and I hope it all works well. So now we will launch. So for our, for each speaker, do know there is biographies available in the materials on the website. I'm not going to spend a lot of time telling you who these people are. So accept that as a given. So the first speaker is David Michaels, who is at the Milken Institute School of Public Health at George Washington University. And welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ross. I'm really pleased to be here. I thought yesterday was a terrific meeting, and I'm looking forward to today's talk. I'm going to be speaking about how we protect public health in the face of corporate disinformation. To begin, though, just my funding disclosure is very appropriate for a meeting like this. My salary comes from the Milken Institute School of Public Health at George Washington University, with a significant portion funded by the Michelatan Foundation through George Washington. I have a couple of relationships with potential conflicts of interest. I'm a consultant to the Asbestos Claimants Committee in the Georgia Pacific Best Wall bankruptcy case. And I've agreed to be an expert witness, though I haven't yet done anything, in a case the Attorney General of the state of Mississippi, a suit against Johnson & Johnson around talc in baby powder. I'll be talking a lot about my book. Funding support for my book, came from the Milken Institute School of Public Health and 4 foundations: the Forsythia Foundation, the Passport Foundation, the Broadreach Fund, and the Bauman Foundation. And I was also supported by the Rockefeller Foundation through a residency at the Bellagio Center, where I wrote a good portion of the book. So I want to talk about sort of the rise of corporate disinformation about harms. That's sort of the thesis of my talk, that it's become standard operating procedure for corporations to create and disseminate disinformation by hiring what are called product defense experts. And that's their term, not mine, to manufacture scientific uncertainty about the harms of these products or activities. This is sometimes called doubt science because it really is about uncertainty. Of course, this can be all traced back on one level to tobacco. It's very important for the tobacco industry to promote the idea that, or to oppose the idea that smoking tobacco caused illness. That became especially important once the studies came out in the early 1950s, showing the relationship between lung cancer and cigarette smoking. And so it's all very well known that Hill and Knowlton sort of advised, the public relations firm Hill and Knowlton advised the tobacco industry essentially how to manufacture uncertainty to convince people that there was not sufficient evidence to stop smoking or to regulate tobacco. This was summed up particularly well in a memo that was found in the tobacco documents, which exist at the Truth Tobacco Library at University of California, San Francisco, where several of our speakers are based as well. These documents are an incredible source of information to understand how the tobacco industry conceived of this campaign and how they ran it so successfully for so many decades. And this memo very famously is doubt is our product, not tobacco, but doubt is our product. Since it's the best means of competing with the so-called body of fact that exists in the minds of the general public, it's the means of establishing controversy. And that basic idea will come back to controversy, confusion. The tobacco industry did everything they could to say there are other things that cause lung cancer, and of course there are people who smoke who don't get lung cancer, and that was sort of a great way to do it. One thing they did was they sent out reports, sort of like the equivalent now of Twitter, getting information out to many, many people. This was sent to physicians and researchers, scientists. Anything that caused controversy would be reported. Of course, was particularly interested in this article, lung cancer rare in bald men. But you could find anything in in these documents. Of course, we saw the same thing with global warming and how the fossil fuel industry funded a whole sort of industry, a so-called scientific industry of people who look like scientists who would claim that there's great disagreement on global warming. We now know that from internal papers as well, that the fossil fuel companies all had a tremendously accurate understanding of what was going to happen if we keep pumping greenhouse gases into the environment. Yet they also funded all these groups that just said, we don't know enough, there's a lot of controversy, therefore let's not do anything. When you think about this product defense, this new industry, I like to think of it, or I used to think of it as the Enronization of science. You probably remember the Enron company, which was a very successful, profitable company until it collapsed. It was a house of cards. There was no there. Perhaps I should change this now to the FTXization of science, with essentially, phony companies producing paperwork, producing documents that claim one thing, but really have nothing behind them. So there are these scientists, many of whom work for very lucrative scientific consulting firms, who've been hired to defend products or activities in the regulatory or legal arenas. And the value of that work is to influence regulation and litigation, not to produce valid science. In fact, their science is really of questionable value. The way they market it, asbestos, tobaccos, pharmaceuticals, they're telling you if you run a corporation and you are concerned about a product you make that could be causing people to be sick, these people will help you. And so they warn that there's scarce science and the loss of presumptive innocence. And that's a really important idea, because what they've done here is they've taken the concept that we all have, we all firmly believe, and we've sort of integrated into our thinking, that individuals who are in criminal cases, defendants are innocent until proven guilty. And therefore, if you apply that to chemicals or to other products and make people think, without saying it, that they're innocent until proven guilty, that they're presumptively innocent, it's a much higher bar to essentially get something off the market to protect the public's health. I've seen lots and lots of examples of this. Here's one from that company, Hill & Knowlton. This is one when they were trying to sell their services to the beryllium industry. I knew the beryllium industry because I used to be the chief regulator, the chief safety officer for the nuclear weapons complex, where a lot of beryllium is used. We had hundreds of people with beryllium disease. We were moving toward regulating beryllium. Hill & Knowlton said, look, beryllium, you have a public relations problem. Let me tell you what we did for other industries. And here's a list. And just to look at one of the case studies they give, which is essentially the fluorocarbons, and there were scientific allegations around fluorocarbons. That's that criminal, defense mindset. Is that despite the fact there was no real scientific proof of the charges, it would be years before facts could be assembled. The media fastened on the threat of increased skin cancer and the doomsday aspect of the story. Fluorocarbons were in trouble, so Hill & Knowlton was asked by DuPont to help calm fears, get better reporting of the issues, and gain up to 2 or 3 years before the government took action. And that's what they did. DuPont had a new product. They didn't lose market share. Unfortunately, the hole in the ozone got that much bigger. And that's often the model. Just delay regulation, put things off so we can keep our market share. Of course, the scientists in that study, that there weren't really allegations. They were pretty well conceived of scientific theories. They were hard to oppose, and not too long afterwards, the scientists got the Nobel Prize for that work. Another example that was on the web until I wrote about it, the Food and Drug Administration will cancel a drug for only two reasons: if it simply doesn't work, or if its harms greatly outweigh the benefits, because all drugs have some harms, but they have benefits in treating or curing illness. So cancellation of a drug requires an administrative hearing. It's a long process, and you could see what this group boasted, that they were retained by two manufacturers of the drug under attack to define strategy for the hearing, to identify experts to be used to support the drug, to assist in preparation of the experts in written testimony, in other words, to write their testimony, to analyze the testimony of the experts for the FDA, help them, essentially cross-examine them. This led to an extensive process with a written appeal from the first decision, leading to 10 additional years of sales before the drug was ultimately canceled. So for 10 years, these manufacturers could sell a drug that the FDA didn't think they should be selling. So we could really see how it works when we think about this question of how do we protect people from diesel engine emissions? A lot of scientists have believed that diesel engine emissions were carcinogenic, but it's very difficult to study because people who are most heavily exposed, who live near roads where there are a lot of trucks, for example, have lots of different exposures. And it's very difficult to just pull apart what were the effects of diesel engine emissions. So NIOSH and the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health and the National Cancer Institute did a series of studies among miners who work deep underground, mining materials that don't cause lung cancer, but in environments where there's these giant diesel engines. So that was their main exposure. And those studies, which the industry fought for years and used all sorts of political tools to try to stop the studies. And that's a whole chapter in my book. But once the studies came out, not surprisingly, they found that diesel engine exhaust is a lung carcinogen. That led to the International Agency for Research on Cancer to classify diesel engine exhaust as carcinogenic to humans. And that, of course, leads to all sorts of different requirements. The industry really didn't like it. So, of course, what did they do? They went to some of these product defense firms to produce essentially disinformation, to confuse the public. So they did a study, a critical assessment of studies. In other words, I would call this a strategic literature review. They looked at every study. They said, there's a problem with this study. There's a problem with that study. Well, they did it again, and they did it again. Now, because of some legislation that the tobacco industry really conceived of and helped push through, studies that are done by the government or paid for by the government, the investigators have to release their raw data to anyone to reanalyze that data. And if you're an epidemiologist, if you give me data from a positive study, I could change the parameters, do all sorts of sort of easy alchemy and turn a positive study negative. And that's exactly what the industry did, using some of these same consultants for companies like Gradient and Exponent. They reanalyzed the data and they said, well, these parameters are wrong. Let's do it this way or let's do it that way. And each time they did it, the excess lung cancer disappeared. Magic. Of course, there have been several studies since, other populations finding excess lung cancer in people exposed to diesel exhaust and bladder cancer as well. But this was a rearguard action to slow down any attempt to cut back the use of diesel. And it just went on and on. But in the long run, it fails, but the point is to delay. Similarly, you could see this with these perfluorinated compounds. They're in the press all the time, sometimes called the forever chemicals. They have very strong bonds. They're great repelling both water and oil. So they're used very, very widely. They also have some very significant toxic effects. The history of how these defense product experts were used is pretty sordid. You may have seen the movie Dark Waters, and outside of a DuPont plant in Petersburg, West Virginia, one farmer first, then other people saw their cattle were dying in very strange ways. People were very upset. DuPont, the manufacturer there, recommended product defense from Terra with Michael Dorson, who had been later was actually an attempted nominee. It was a nominee by President Trump to be a very high EPA position, but the nomination failed. really because of a lot of this work. Anyway, Terra and Dorson recommended that West Virginia set a safe level for drinking water at 150 parts per billion, even though internally DuPont had done studies and they thought 1 part per billion was probably a safe level. And then you start seeing these lawsuits and more concern. So DuPont hired ChemRisk, whose director had done a lot of work for the tobacco industry, to say, okay, how much exposure is out there and what levels of exposure, and are people likely to get sick? So that study went back and looked at what Terra had done and said, look, on the basis of that level, the level that people are exposed to, the level of PFAS exposures in that area are 10,000 times higher than the level that might be making people sick. So in other words, don't worry about this. There's really no danger. Of course, what went on there, and this is depicted in the movie, is really interesting, is there was an agreement between the attorneys representing these members of the public who had been drinking C8, which is another way to call these PFAS chemicals that were used in this plant. DuPont and the lawyers agreed on 3 independent scientists to conduct studies that would be paid for by DuPont, but they would be independent of DuPont. DuPont would have no role in managing the studies. And these studies found probable links between exposure and ulcerative colitis, thyroid disease, testicular and kidney cancer, in this case among the workers, pregnancy-induced hypertension, and high cholesterol. So a lot of very excellent studies finding some very serious effects. But then, the manufacturers of PFAS really need to regroup and fight those studies. So there were big suits. The state of Minnesota sued 3M because 3M polluted the water around their plants. So 3M hired Exponent to review all the literature, and they conclude the epidemiologic evidence does not support the hypothesis of a causal association between these chemicals and cancer. Now, that case never went to court because 3M settled for $850 million. I think they probably figured that literature review was not enough. Similarly, the U.S. National Toxicology Program reviewed the evidence and concluded that these chemicals are immune hazards, and another 3M consultant essentially disagreed and said, NTP's conclusions are wrong and the hazard rating should be downgraded. Similarly, 3M's consultant said, look, the overall weight of the evidence is not sufficient to demonstrate causal associations between exposure to specific chemicals and any adverse outcomes. So really don't worry about this. Of course, there are more and more studies. There's a huge number of very good studies going on. In 2016, EPA issued health advisory for water, 70 parts per trillion. Now remember, DuPont's internal was 1 part per billion or 1,000 parts per trillion. In 2022, EPA lowered those to 0.004 parts per trillion for one chemical, 0.02 for the other. Essentially, while the industry was saying there's no evidence, there's not enough evidence, or there's not compelling evidence that this causes illness, EPA is saying there's no evidence it's safe. These levels are so astoundingly low. So who pays the price? First of all, people who are sickened by exposures that should have been prevented, and shareholders occasionally when their corporation that they own shares of were caught manipulating scientific evidence. One good example of this is Johnson & Johnson that announced recently they're going to stop selling their iconic product, baby powder, stop selling talcum powder baby powder globally. They're going to actually just sell the same product, but make it out of cornstarch, which is obviously going to be safer. Now, the reason the concern about talc is mined in almost every mine with talc has asbestos. The minerals come together. There's been a lot of focus on asbestos contamination of talc and diseases caused by asbestos. There have been some lawsuits because there have been quite a few case control studies that found ovarian cancer is associated with the use of talcum powder. There are some cohort studies that don't find that. So there's some questions in the literature, but there have been a bunch of lawsuits. In one lawsuit, 22 women with ovarian cancer sued Johnson & Johnson, alleging their ovarian cancer was caused by Johnson's baby powder. The jurors agreed. They awarded the women $550 million, or $25 million each. Now, I want to disclose, I was a fact witness. I was not an expert witness, so I was an unpaid fact witness in this case, and that actually gave me access to incredible documents about an disinformation campaign. The jurors were given documents showing how J&J and their trade associations tried to convince the US government not to label products containing talc as potentially carcinogenic. The ones I'm going to talk about today are focused on the Board of Scientific Counselors of the US National Toxicology Program. And that was of interest to me because I'm on the Board of Scientific Counselors of the National Toxicology Program. And when I was in the government and I ran the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, I was the chair of the Executive Council of the NTP. So in 2000, NTP considered categorizing asbestiform talc as a carcinogen and talc, a non-asbestiform talc, as reasonably anticipated to be a human carcinogen. And so, of course, the talc producers hired product defense firms to oppose this, because if baby powder had to have a warning saying this could cause cancer, people would stop buying it, right? The objective, and this was in the documents I read, to create a reasonable doubt in the minds of the Board of Scientific Counselors. And the strategy, and literally it said this, come up with more confusion. Well, jurors didn't like that. And so they awarded, in addition to that, those $25 billion each, they awarded the women $4 billion in punitive damages from J&J. And that was cut in half, but J&J actually had to pay more than $2 billion in punitive damage. One juror told the press, we just were trying to find something that they would feel, that Johnson & Johnson would feel. So 2 years ago, J&J stopped selling talc-based baby powder in the United States and Canada. They shifted over to cornstarch, and as you saw, they've just recently done that globally. They're facing about 38,000 lawsuits, and they're now attempting what's called the Texas two-step. They want to avoid liability by they're creating a subsidy, which is going to have all that liability, and spinning it off into bankruptcy, which means most of those women will never see anything or very little in a lawsuits. Of course, an alternative would have been in 2000 when all these studies came out to say, okay, talc could be dangerous, let's move to cornstarch, and that would have avoided all of this. So these product defense firms, we know that how they work because we understand what their employees say. And so I looked on Glassdoor, which is a website where workers put up information about their employers, and here are a couple of very brief sentences, things they put up. A ChemRisk employee said, this is a law consulting company, not a science consulting company. Don't expect to be a scientist. Worker Gradient said, some of the principal scientists have questionable ethics and been called out for it. Or Exponent, sometimes you'll be working for the evildoers and trying to make it seem like they did nothing wrong. So I write about this in my book. It impacts the air, the water. It's driven the opioid and the obesity epidemics. There are many, many examples because it's so successful. It works. I think it impacts all of us. It hurts the credibility of all scientists. When people see scientists arguing and people throw their hands up and say, well, look, we just don't know. It leads to cynicism, but also it means the product defense firms are successful. They don't have to actually, their clients have won. So to counter this, I think first we have to learn to distinguish between real uncertainty and manufactured uncertainty. We've got to build a scientific evidence base with research produced by independent, unconflicted scientists. I think the talks you heard yesterday from Lisa Barrow and Dan Greenbaum really focused on that. And certainly the work of the Health Effects Institute is a really important, I think, very positive example of the way that independent scientists can be used successfully. Polluters and producers of hazardous chemicals should have to pay for the research. If you're making a product, we need to know if it's safe, and you should be responsible for that. But they shouldn't be able to control the research. If they do control the research, as you heard from Lisa Barrow's talk, the funding effect will change the results. So the research has to be directed by independent, unconflicted scientists. I also think it's really important that we move away from regulating toxic chemicals one by one and move to thinking about them as a class, even if we don't have data on all 9,000 chemicals within which are PFAS. We know enough about some of them to think all of them could be somewhat dangerous, and we have to think about them as a class. And that presumption of innocence has to end. Chemicals are not innocent until proven guilty. So remember, we need new solutions, and we have to be bold. This requires major change. So thank you so much for listening, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the session.
Thank you very much, Dr. Michaels, and we will hold all our questions until we get to the discussion period.